Hi, everyone. Welcome to our teach-in on the Transportation and Climate Initiative. I'm Betta Broad with New Yorkers for Clean Power.
I'm Michaela Shabako.
And we're here in our office in Kingston, New York. And we're really excited to have some super informative speakers tonight who are each going to present briefly, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. If you are on your computer, which hopefully most of you are on Zoom, at the bottom of the bar, there's a Q&A button in the middle, and you can just hit that and then enter in your question. So that way, as each speaker presents, we won't lose your question, you won't forget it, we'll capture it, and then at the end, we'll go back and get your questions answered. So with no further ado, again, thank you so much for joining all of our attendees, and thank you to our speakers for being here. Our very first speaker tonight is Allison Considine from the Sierra Club. She is a campaign representative and working specifically on transportation. And it's been a great honor and delight to get to connect with Allison over the past 6 months or a year. And so pleased that you could be here tonight to give us kind of an overview of transportation in New York, the problems, and then we're gonna get into the possible solutions. So thank you so much, and I will allow you to start sharing your screen.
Awesome.
Cool.
It's Betta, and hi everyone. Thanks for making time to be here on a rather stormy August night. Like Betta said, my name is Allison Considine. I'm the New York campaign representative for the Sierra Club. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let's see.
Great.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, I'm hoping that this teach-in can be a chance for us to share some information on the importance of tackling emissions from our transportation sector and fill folks in on this one key tool to help us do that, the Transportation and Climate Initiative. So New York and our neighboring states, from Maine all the way down to Virginia, have been interested in tackling pollution through a regional framework as part of broader efforts to cut pollution and tackle the climate crisis. And the reason we're focusing on transportation here is because it's the largest source of pollution, both in our state and in the region. And it's also a major source of pollutants that contribute to unhealthy air and a range of health harms, from asthma attacks to heart attacks and premature mortality. So this policy is under design this year, and I'm going to be kind of zooming out and discussing the scope and scale of the problem that's necessitated policies like this before passing it over to my colleague, Uchenna with the Natural Resources Defense Council, who's going to be diving into some more details about TCI specifically. So we spend a lot of time talking about the climate crisis as it relates to power generation or plastic straws, depending on the circles you run in. But we don't spend as much time talking about transportation. Transportation really connects every element of our society, our economy, whether you're taking the MTA in New York City or bike lanes throughout the state, buses, scooters, pedestrian pathways, transit-oriented development. There's a lot of different aspects of our society that transportation touches. And the sort of elephant in the room is cars. So in New York State, specifically, transportation accounts for 40% of our CO2 emissions. And this is a growing, so as you can see in the bottom right of this slide here, transportation sector emissions have been growing over time, and the largest contributor within the transportation sector is on-road vehicles. And this poses some really unique challenges to us. One being vehicle lifetime. So the average lifetime of a vehicle in New York is 15 and a half years. As someone whose first car was a 1999 Chevy Malibu, I can attest that some of those cars stick around for a really long time. But that's a real big problem, given that we're trying to cut emissions and meet goals like a 40% reduction by 2030 economy-wide in New York. And cars coming onto the road today could conceivably still be on road and still polluting in 2030. Another sort of unique challenge that this poses is, in a sense, each and every one of us, when we drive a car or ride on the bus, is a little polluter, meaning we'll need to be thinking a bit differently about cutting our emissions than we've used in the power generation sector, for example. Thirdly, transportation represents a huge range of modes, and some of those, like air travel, haven't yet reached the level of tech and cost advancement to make sure that we can be reducing those emissions today. So it kind of necessitates that we focus on areas that are easier to cut our emissions from, like on-road sources and vehicles. But the challenges of this go beyond just carbon emissions. Transportation, particularly public transit, binds our communities together, but these vital services run on poisonous fossil fuels and lead to serious health impacts, particularly for low-income communities and communities of color across the state who suffer these impacts disproportionately. So decisions about where to place highways, where to invest in public transportation, where to build housing, have all contributed to this transportation system that's concentrating emissions in communities of color. And in many cases, these policies at the local, state, and federal level have left folks with inadequate access to public transportation, have left communities divided by highways, and have left large swaths of New Yorkers breathing polluted air. And in other parts of the state, we have rural and suburban communities without really adequate access to public transit systems, and no choice but to rely on a car or dependent on limited service, which doesn't always connect people to the vital services they need. And so to go into a little bit more detail about that, in New York, there's several key pollutants coming from the transportation sector that I think it's worth highlighting when we're thinking about how this policy could help benefit folks. So PM 2.5 is basically soot. And this fine particulate pollution can lead to really intense health effects, from asthma attacks to cardiovascular diseases. It's been linked to lung cancer, and it's been linked to slowed lung growth function and the development of asthma in children. And this is particularly an issue in communities that are located close to highways, and in areas where there's heavy impacts from passenger vehicles, freight trucking, and diesel burning vehicles. So what I'm kind of saying is our system as it stands isn't just failing to work from a climate perspective. It's actually killing us and making us sick, but not in equal ways. So in New York City alone, exposure to PM 2.5 has been linked to an estimated 320 premature deaths per year, which is more than have been killed in traffic fatalities in 2017. And since the start of this year alone, 18 cyclists have been killed by vehicles in New York City. So our car-centric culture, the way that we rely on mobility right now, is not working for New Yorkers or across the region. And the pollution burden isn't distributed equally. On average, PM 2.5 exposures are higher for non-white New Yorkers, and this is more pronounced between racial and ethnic groups than it is between income groups. But New Yorkers are ready for a change. And at the Sierra Club, we did some polling in 2018, and we asked New Yorkers if they considered this air pollution to be a problem, if they supported investments by our state in electric vehicles and public transportation, and if they think that cars and trucks play a key role in creating this air pollution. And across the political spectrum and across the state, voters said that they did, and that 77% of them were supportive of state action to clean this up, and 74% supported moving forward with a regional transportation modernization plan that limits pollution by investing in alternatives like EVs, public transit, and safer communities for walking and biking. And going beyond the effects of health and climate change, New York voters believe that this will have a positive effect on jobs and a positive effect on health. And so basically what I'm trying to get at is we don't have time to waste. There's severe consequences for inaction. As the IPCC has informed us and the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is just written into law, we need to commit to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in New York City. And to get there, we're pretty much going to have to electrify all of that on-road transportation. And this is going to mean really major changes across the state. But this is also an opportunity because right now in New York, people lack access to clean, reliable, affordable, and safe transportation. This limits their ability to participate in all aspects of our communities, from accessing healthcare to education to culture and food access. And as I've talked about, right now the system has been designed in a way that impacts some New Yorkers more than other. And that makes it really critical that this process of designing this policy and implementing it in New York State centers frontline communities and ensures that benefits and revenues are reinvested to impact those New Yorkers who've suffered disproportionately from the way our transportation system is currently designed. And the thing is, this solution is sort of a unique fit for a unique problem because transportation is an inherently regional issue. If you've ever driven from New York City to upstate, you've probably passed through New Jersey and Pennsylvania on the way. And as we all know—
Allison, I hate to interrupt you, but there's a little bit of a fade out issue going on. I don't know if other people are noticing that, but, and I don't know why, but we can still hear you, but at times like it'll sort of fade out at the end of a sentence. So I don't know if there's something you're covering up with your mic or something. I just wanted to—
I don't think so, but I can try moving closer.
No. We're still getting what you're saying.
Okay.
Okay, but I just wanted to mention it.
No, thank you. I'll try to adjust my screen, see if that helps. But yeah, basically this approach is sort of unique because it recognizes that our transportation system is interconnected and there's going to be certain advantages and efficiencies from working as a region and not just within our own state bounds to address this. So by investing in regional solutions, we can achieve these mandates at a lower cost, we can build a unified clean transportation system, and we can amplify our own leadership in New York across the region to achieve even greater emissions reductions. Because the thing is, we have the solutions. We have the technology for zero emission vehicles, buses, trucks, and port equipment. We know the benefits of safe bike lanes and walking paths, expanded rail lines and affordable housing near transit hubs, and community design that prioritizes people over cars. And all New Yorkers deserve these things. So I'm hoping that in this discussion, we can learn a little bit more about how the Transportation and Climate Initiative is one tool in our toolbox that can help us set a declining cap and can generate revenues to help us realize this right and start to ameliorate the destructive health, economic, and climate impacts that have resulted from the way we've designed our transportation system so far. Let's get to work. I'm going to pass it back to Betta now, and I think our colleague Uchenna is going to go next.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. That was a fantastic overview of our transportation system, the problems, and really appreciate you bringing all that to our attention. And next, we are going to have Uchenna Bright, who is with the NRDC's Climate and Clean Energy Program, talking about, as Allison put it, one of the tools in our toolbox of solutions for this big problem of transportation being the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. So Uchenna, I was hoping to hold up your study that or report that you did on Transportation Reimagined, but it seems that someone walked off with my last copy. But it is a fantastic report that you put together, and hopefully we can send a link after to that, because I know you're so knowledgeable on this, and we're really grateful to have you here tonight. So I will pass it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betta, and thank you, Allison, for teeing this up for me and us. So as you've just heard, and I'm sure you know from personal experience, we have a number of transportation challenges to solve in New York. There are also numerous solutions, but the question is, how are we going to scale up these solutions to take advantage of them in our state and across the region? Our roads and our railways and our interlinked communities don't just stop at state lines, right? So as Allison mentioned, TCI, or the Transportation and Climate Initiative, is one of the most promising paths forward. TCI is a group of 12 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states in the city of Washington, D.C., committed to finding solutions to our transportation problems. As you can see here, in addition to New York, the other TCI states include New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Over the past 2 years, New York and its TCI partners have been exploring potential regional policy framework to tackle transportation emissions and to modernize our transportation system together. Last year, the states held a series of public listening sessions across the region, including in Albany and in New York City, to get stakeholder input on our transportation challenges and to solicit ideas for how we can successfully implement a clean transportation future. New York also held a series of state-specific public listening sessions or public meetings to discuss the wide range of issues with a wide range of stakeholders, including in New Paltz, Williamsville, Syracuse, Brooklyn, and Wading River on Long Island. These meetings uncovered a strong interest in taking a regional approach to fixing transportation. In December 2018, a group of 9 states, TCI states and DC, committed to spend this year, so 2019, working together to develop a regional policy proposal. Now, while New York didn't formally sign on to that commitment, the state has continued to be actively involved in these discussions with its TCI partners. The specific policy that New York and the other states are exploring is known as Cap and Invest. It's a policy that many stakeholders voiced support for during last year's TCI listening session. And it's a design that has successfully helped cut power plant pollution across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region over the last decade. California is also currently using a Cap and Invest policy framework to cut greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, transportation vehicles, and other sectors statewide. At a basic level, a Cap and Invest policy in the transportation sector would require pollution reductions while generating a significant source of funding to invest in clean and modern transportation solutions that we need and want to see in New York and the rest of the region. As shown on this slide, there are 3 basic components to a Cap and Invest policy for transportation. The first is the policy would establish a cap or an enforceable limit on carbon pollution for transportation fuels across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. This cap could apply to all transportation fuels or to only specific fuels. Most likely the cap would cover at least the carbon emissions from gasoline and on-road diesel fuels, which account for a large majority of transportation pollution, about 80%. The regional carbon cap would decline over time, as you see here, ensuring that we make continued progress on pollution and on reducing pollution and in addressing the climate crisis. The level of the cap and the rate of required emissions reductions, which defines how ambitious the program would actually be, is set by New York and the other state partners. So where should the cap be set? In New York, in New York's case and in some other states in the region, as Allison mentioned, we have a statutory mandate, the CLCPA, to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 2050. The transportation sector is only part of the problem, but as we heard earlier, it's the biggest source of pollution statewide. So the cap on transportation pollution must be sufficiently ambitious to allow us to meet our climate goals. The TCI states are currently doing technical modeling and analysis to determine where the cap levels should be. The second part of the Cap and Invest policy is identifying who the regulated parties would be under the cap, or more simply, who would be required to cut pollution. The TCI states are looking at applying this requirement on large transportation fuel suppliers in the region. These suppliers would be required to purchase what are known as carbon allowances to account for the carbon pollution that results from the fuels the suppliers sell. Each carbon allowance would be equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. For example, 1 million gallons of gasoline will release about 10,000 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere when that fuel is burned in a vehicle engines. So a fuel supplier selling 1 million gallons of gasoline into New York would be required to purchase 10,000 carbon allowances to account for the pollution resulting from its sales. The total number of carbon allowances made available would be equal to the level of carbon emissions permitted under the cap in any given year. As the cap ratchets down, fewer allowances would be made available, and suppliers would have to reduce their pollution, switching to cleaner alternatives. Finally, the allowances made available each year would be sold to suppliers at auction, and states like New York that participate in the program would use these auction proceeds to invest in cleaner, more efficient, more affordable transportation solutions. These investments could be targeted to ensure that New Yorkers in rural, urban, suburban communities have access to clean transportation options, such as by expanding and improving public transit, including paratransit for people with disabilities and transit options for rural and suburban areas, electrifying transit buses and school buses, lowering the cost of purchasing electric vehicles and providing the infrastructure needed to charge these vehicles with clean, renewable energy, installing wide and level sidewalks, safe crosswalks, and productive bike lanes, investing in and adopting complementary policies to ensure equitable and affordable transit-oriented housing and smart land use planning. There are many details that still need to be worked out to create a successful program, including the cap level, which fuels will be covered, and the specific way in which the proceeds will be invested. The design and implementation of a cap and invest policy also raises equity concerns, which must be addressed. Stephan will go into these issues in more detail, but briefly, it's critical to ensure that in addition to cutting carbon pollution, we also cut other harmful pollution from transportation under cap and invest and through other complementary policies, particularly in frontline communities which have historically suffered adverse health effects and are disproportionately affected by pollution harms. We must also ensure that frontline communities, low-income residents least well-served by our current transportation networks, and communities most vulnerable to and already experiencing the impacts of climate change are at the front of the line in receiving the benefits of a cap and invest policy, including cleaner air, improved and expanded access to public transit and mobility options, and investments in climate resiliency strategies and infrastructure. In New York, we have a head start on other TCI states because of the CLCPA. It establishes a strong standard for ensuring an equitable distribution of benefits under the state's climate policies, including requirements that disadvantaged communities receive 40% of the overall benefits. These requirements will be further informed by the processes and safeguards established by the CLCPA, such as the work of the forthcoming Climate Action Council, the Climate Justice Working Group, and the creation of a community air monitoring program to improve air quality in communities affected by local air pollution. If designed well, a cap and invest policy for transportation and its associated investments in clean and modern transportation solutions would help us make major progress on our transportation challenges, from climate change to clean air to enhanced mobility. But it's also important to recognize that the TCI discussions around regional cap and invest policy aren't happening in a vacuum. Alongside TCI, we can and should make progress on a number of other policy efforts, some of which are already underway, some of which could be adopted alongside or prior to or after the cap and invest structure is in place. Some examples of these complementary policies, as you can see here, include congestion pricing, which has been approved by New York City and will provide critical investments in public transportation in the New York City metropolitan area. Power sector decarbonization that ensures electric vehicles can be charged with clean, emission-free, renewable energy. Federal vehicle emissions and fuel efficiency standards to ensure vehicles on our roads are increasingly clean and efficient. Equitable transit-oriented development with provisions for affordable housing. Greater investment in public transportation to provide better, more reliable access. Wider, safer sidewalks for pedestrians and protected bike lanes for cyclists. Land use policies, EV tax credits and incentives such as vehicle rebates, particularly programs designed to assist low-income purchasers, and EV car sharing programs. Complementary policies and programs at the state, local, and federal levels that reduce transportation emissions will make it easier to reach a more ambitious carbon cap under a TCI policy. At the same time, a strong and ambitious TCI policy will generate funding that can help support and build on these complementary policies, and together they provide a virtuous cycle. So what happens next? New York and the other TCI states are actively working to develop a low-carbon transportation policy, which will most likely be cap and invest framework, as we've just discussed, but with the details, to be hammered out between now and then. As the states develop this policy, they are seeking input from stakeholders. In recent months, there have been more stakeholder meetings held across the region, and starting next week, New York's lead state agencies that are working on TCI, the Department of Environmental Conservation, or the DEC, the DOT, or the Department of Transportation, and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, will kick off a public process in New York to solicit input directly from New Yorkers in these discussions. The first meeting will take place in Albany on August 15th, and more details are available at www.dec.ny.gov/energy/99223.html, but that URL is actually shown on the screen right now.
And we'll share it.
We expect additional.
Oh, I just said we'll be sure to share the registration link for that also in our follow-up email.
Yes. So we expect additional stakeholder meetings to be held around the state in the weeks ahead, and TCI policy TCI states will announce their proposed policy by the end of the year, and individual states, including possibly New York, will begin adopting this policy into law in 2020 and likely into 2021 as well. So once a critical mass of TCI states has adopted the policy, implementation will begin. And the threshold for this critical mass, like some other things, is not yet been defined, but could be part of the end of the year announcement. And this is an exciting process with potential enormous benefits for New York, but there are still many issues to resolve between now and December and the eventual start of a TCI policy implementation. And to ensure that the TCI policy is successful, it's critical that we ensure that the policy is equitable, which Stephan, who Betta will introduce next, will talk about more. Betta?
Thanks so much, Uchenna. That was a lot to cover in a short time. I'm surprised there aren't like 500 more questions, but I'm sure people are just trying to absorb all of the information that you just shared. So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll get into more detail in the Q&A. But yes, you touched on the importance of TCI being implemented equitably, and we're going to now pass it off to Stephan Edel, the project director of the New York Working Families, to delve even more deeply into that critical aspect of this whole process. So Stephan, thank you for being here, and last but not least, please take it away, and we don't have to worry about slides. We'll just let you just go for it.
Great, and folks can look at me, and we'll send around some materials afterwards, but I didn't prepare slides, so you just get to look at me talking. So I'll start off by saying, I'm here representing myself and working families. I'm not speaking for environmental justice groups or frontline communities, low-income communities, or for the coalitions we're part of. I'm just going to give kind of my understanding of, what it would take for TCI to be equitable based on the conversations we've had. As it was sort of laid out earlier, a cap and invest system, the model that TCI is focused on at the moment, but like all policies, will not necessarily be equitable, right? This could be a good policy, it could be a bad policy, and whether it comes out as one or the other will depend a lot on the engagement in the process that is happening now in New York, and vitally how New York chooses to engage and lead or not lead. So this is a pivotal moment for New York to sort of step in and ensure that as the largest emitter in this region, as the largest economy in the region, that we're playing a role pushing for this to be as equitable as possible and making our determination on entering based on that. The state has taken big steps, but there is a tremendous amount left, as other speakers have said, to be determined, and a lot of questions about the final design of TCI. To the extent that this policy is not designed with a clear and accountable set of goals, reducing local pollution disparities and addressing the environmental justice concerns, we know from experience that they will not be addressed, right? That we can't come back afterwards easily and say, okay, we're going to address this. And we can't trust that spending plans and other things will automatically fix it. And so as we're moving forward, we need to be really conscious and clear that this has to be done equitably, and that there's a real opportunity here to make sure that that happens, and it'll have benefits not just for communities in New York, but across the region. So that means that, as the speakers today have really tried to do, climate advocates and activists have to be conscious not just of concerns about policy details around emission reduction, but about how the process is being moved forward and how those details are worked out, so that they actually are taking on and adopting some of the feedback that's coming from communities, the communities that are most impacted by these decisions, and not simply having a public process that tokenizes folks and has them speak, but not actually taking on what they're saying. So a lot of this has been touched on, but why TCI matters and doing it equitably matters is that, this is a huge portion of our emissions, and it's a particularly harmful one for low-income communities, communities of color, environmental justice communities that are overburdened with depots for trucking, with freeways, with a whole host of things. And so if we do this right, it not only is a really powerful climate tool, but actually one that could improve health and environmental justice and unequal burdens in our communities. Again, that is not guaranteed. This is a really pivotal time to try and make sure that happens. And that there has been some outreach, but that we really need to continue to make sure that the pressure is on for that, and that as folks are engaging and we're educating our members and communities about this, that they understand these broader issues. So I want to just also highlight, there have been a lot of concerns expressed. There are a lot of folks, particularly in the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement, with concerns about it. And I before I kind of go into what an equitable TCI looks like, want to be clear, there have been serious process concerns. Many of us have been involved in those stakeholder meetings, and, seen that there is sort of a model that has been from the beginning the goal, and that is not necessarily a bad thing, but that for many communities weighing in, it has not been clear how much has been baked and how their feedback is being taken on board. And for folks who want to dig in more on that, Climate Justice Alliance and others have very clearly articulated those concerns. And second, that there is, for many advocates, a very significant concern about any pollution pricing or market mechanism. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on that, but the Indigenous Environmental Network, Climate Justice Alliance, and others have very articulately put that together and put it out there, and we'll send around one piece later on that goes into some of those details and what could make it work. But that it's just very important that folks realize that this is not a uniformly supported policy, particularly because the experience of a lot of communities is that even if it's well-intentioned, that they're not going to benefit adequately. So with that sort of framing, what does an equitable TCI look like? And there are lots of answers for that, but I'll kind of run through some features here. So as I said, New York has this opportunity to really push, right? And we're negotiating with somewhere between 9 and 11 other states, but that New York is such a big player that there's a real opportunity for New York to say, here's what doing it right looks like. It has to actually bake in, right, from the start, measures to ensure that overburdened communities are actually having their local emissions reduced, right? It can't simply focus on greenhouse gas emissions. And many of the advocates have been working on this, that there has to be a continued focus on making sure that there are specific benchmarks, not just for the spending side, but also tracking and evaluating how emissions are being affected in particular communities, and then efforts to focus reductions in those communities. And that may mean supplemental policies, but it also, to whatever degree possible, has to be deeply ingrained in TCI. The second is, when that revenue is collected, we need to really focus those investments on the communities that need it most. And the Climate and Community Protection Act sets a floor for that of 40% we'd like to see. It's going to be a challenge to make sure that happens, but we should really focus our efforts in making sure that those investments are going to the places, not just where they have the greatest emission reduction for climate benefits, but also to the places where it's going to create the strongest local emission reductions, improve health, create good jobs, and actually expand access from underserved communities to transportation. All of those things are rooted in a process that really listens to communities and hears distinctions between different environmental justice communities, from rural, suburban, and urban communities. And that may take some time, right? We're rushing, everybody feels the urgency of climate change, but I think we have to really think about, like, how do we do this right and continue to build and engage and build more momentum to make sure it's done right, not just done fast. Communities need to be at the table, right? And that doesn't mean just showing up for 4 or 5 hearings coming up, but that in addition, we need to continue thinking of more ways to engage and bring in community voices, particularly community voices who are going to have a very hard time going to a hearing in Albany or a listening session in a few places around the state. It has to be timed and paired with a commitment to eliminate emissions, and this is a key piece of the CLCPA, but that the challenge technically of coming up with a system that caps emissions that actually will drive down emissions in line with the benchmarks of the CLCPA to get us to the 2030 goals and to get us to essentially eliminating emissions from carbon in 2050. And those are, like, that is a key goal of TCI, but that's a piece that's going to take a tremendous amount of work down the road to actually ensure both that it starts off right and then it keeps getting adjusted as we go. And then we need to really think through the spending plan and how the linkage between allowances and the cost of those allowances are generating revenue. So one of the problems we've had with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is the cap doesn't go down fast enough. So people have not, it hasn't generated the revenue or the emission reductions that it could potentially. So we need to think about those things and then see that we're actually bringing in enough revenue and enough emission reductions to be really impactful on both ends. And then think about a plan that actually focuses on a just transition, low-income initiatives, workforce training, public transit, and spending plans that actually really target that money. And so overall, right, that these policies have to be developed in each of the 3 pieces, as Uchenna laid it out, that actually consider and center whether frontline communities are going to benefit or be increasingly burdened. And so that's really key. Often in these conversations, the focus is on how we spend the money, and that isn't necessarily the only place, right? The structure of the cap, how we actually collect it, where those targets are for collecting the requiring the emissions credits to be purchased, and then the spending plan, all are opportunities to ensure equity. And then I think, for us at Working Families in particular, like ensuring that we're starting to push for what many people think of as parallel policies, right? When we're setting that spending plan, ensuring that the money is going to programs and to spending on high road jobs, make sure that there are fair labor standard practices, make sure that we're having contracting standards that support small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses. We're not simply taking that money and putting it in a general climate fund. We're not simply taking that money and using it for the highest greenhouse gas emission reductions we can. Those are really important, but that also building, a strong and supportive local green economy actually makes it more likely, not just that we're equitable, but that we accomplish our goals in the long run. And then finally, we have to think of this, as was laid out earlier, as part of the toolbox, and that means also supporting the many other efforts, and some of those are defensive, right? That privatizing public services, reducing funding for the state agencies and for the public transit agencies that are vital to actually meeting these goals are not outside of the TCI, right? If TCI moves forward and the state and MTA don't have the resources to do their job, then that is deeply and intrinsically attached to whether we accomplish it. So there's a lot more thinking here and a lot more thinking from allies, and so we'll get into question and answer, but I hope that folks follow up and dig in and get involved in the process, but also, follow up with the folks who have done a lot of thinking on equity in the TCI, whether that's the Climate Justice Alliance or Environmental Justice Alliance of New York or others, and we'll send around some materials with the follow-up.
Thanks so much, Stephan. Really appreciate you sharing that critical viewpoint and perspective and the importance of making sure that TCI is implemented equitably. We have a bunch of questions we're going to get to, but before we do that, I just do want to mention once again our follow-up, which Stephan highlighted, that we're going to share some documents. We're also going to share a survey, which it would be fantastic if all of you could fill it out. It's pretty short. But basically, we just want to know some questions about transportation near you. As our panelists talked about, much of this is going to come down to where you live, what the challenges are in your particular community. So we want to identify those. And we also want to identify those of you who are, interested and excited about working on clean transportation in your community and advocating at the state level. So if you could be so kind as to fill out that survey, we're going to be sending that along with the other materials that were mentioned. This is a very complicated topic. There's a lot to it. So I'm sure, this is for many of you just an introduction, and there's a lot more to learn for all of us. So we're in this together, and we're going to stay in touch after tonight and keep building this movement for an equitable and electrified transportation sector with public transit for everyone. So I'm going to keep working on that. But in the meantime, we've got some great questions. And let's see. Okay. We've already answered a few of these. But Michaela, do you want to kick one off for our panelists?
Sure. So I'm not quite sure who wants to give a try at this answer, but many people think that a price on carbon, a fee on each ton of carbon emitted, is a more efficient way to bring down emissions across all sectors than a cap and invest system. Why is a cap and invest? Why is the cap and invest the chosen policy here? It's a big question.
Who wants to take that one? I don't know, Uchenna or Allison?
Or go ahead, either one.
Take it away.
I can take it though. Thank you for the question. I would say that fee and cap and invest are both sort of market mechanisms, and the TCI states have made it clear that they're exploring potential, this is a potential policy, and while there was strong support for it, it was not universal during the listening sessions. This sort of approach is important because our transportation system has that interconnectedness and doesn't sort of stop at state lines. But the policy that most TCI states, including New York, cap and invest is a policy that most states in this sort of framework of TCI already have experience with and have successfully used this approach over the last decade to cut carbon from power plants. And garnered many other benefits, including, improved public health and new jobs and growing economy. So there are sort of lots of potential benefits that the states already sort of have experience with. And it sort of ensures, they have confidence that it'll ensure the trajectory that we need using an ambitious cap. And it's a promising policy tool that they're still exploring.
Okay, does anybody else want to chime in? Or we've got a lot of other questions, but I want to make sure that everyone has a chance if they want to add something.
I mean, I might add just, I think and just full disclosure, I probably would have liked to tax more, but that often it's articulated that a cap offers certainty about how fast and effectively emission reduction goes down. It doesn't, it lets the price of those permits be variable. A tax sets it's much easier to predict the revenue, and it's much easier, we know what the price would be in a particular year per ton because it's set by the tax. But if in fact demand for fossil fuels is less flexible than we think, we might bring in a lot of money but not drive down emissions. So there's sort of an argument for either structure.
Thanks, Stephan. Should we move on to the next question, or Allison, did you have anything to add?
I think they covered it.
Okay. Let's see. We've got it. This is actually probably more for you, Allison. It's more general about transportation. What about rural areas? Most of upstate New York, there are no options for transportation other than having a car. And LMI communities are also rural. So, how is this policy going to help that situation, or, what are some possible solutions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, New York State is not homogenous in terms of where folks live. I'm from upstate myself. I think electric vehicles are one piece of this puzzle. And, I think there's a perception of electric vehicles right now as really expensive. And I think one potential ways that revenue from this type of program could be used would be to help structure the incentives around EVs to ensure that they're accessible to LMI New Yorkers and New Yorkers from a variety of income brackets, and not just those who have the funds to purchase a new vehicle. And I think along with that, building out charging infrastructure and helping fund greater access to charging so that, again, the burden isn't all on people to switch from a pretty accessible gas station to installing charging infrastructure in their homes. So encouraging the state to incentivize charging and EVs, and also, investing more in the transit we have across upstate and kind of reconceptualizing what that could look like. I spent some time living in Tompkins County, and there's one bus line that runs out to some of the smaller towns per day. And so I think if we were creating more funding available for smaller transit agencies and other mobility options that kind of bridge that gap between areas where there's no transit agency or no public transit, to provide more options so that folks aren't kind of left with no choice but to drive a fossil fuel car. So I think it's a bit of a mix, but I think that's a vital perspective to consider when we think about how these revenues are invested. And, luckily there's a lot of good options out there and a lot of good options being innovated.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to chime in with ideas about how to address transportation issues in rural communities? Okay, next question.
This next question might go off of that a little bit. Do you see ride-hailing, like Uber and Lyft, as a part of the solution or a part of the problem?
Who wants to take that one?
I mean, do you want to take that, Allison?
I can kick it off. I mean, I think that's personally, I have a lot of concerns about the ways that the gig economy structure that's being implemented through ride-hailing and transportation network companies is sort of eroding the job standard in the transportation sector, and potentially, pulling riders away from public transit. Or creating like a two-tiered system of who relies on our public transit and who relies on ride-hailing companies. So I think there's a lot of issues. That said, I think right now, ride-hailing companies are often contributing to a lot of idling and congestion in urban areas. And I think figuring out ways to reduce the emissions burden from that and figuring out creative policies to ensure that the supply of provides alternative mobility options as a complement to existing public transit and zero emission transportation options exists, and that there's regulations being put on those tech companies, that industry, to ensure that, we're not kind of going down a certain pathway. But I think there's not a clear solution on that. I think it speaks to a broader issue related to passenger vehicles and how they interact, and a broader issue with how our public transit system has been eroded over time and doesn't always fill the need that people have to get from place to place safely. But I'll throw it to the rest of the panelists.
I mean, I would just add, I agree with everything Allison said. Uber and Lyft and those companies, I'll just, speaking for working families, they've been bad actors, right? Like, I think there's just two different pieces of the question. Is like, is some form of car sharing or platform vehicle access good and actually already improving the lives of rural and suburban people in particular, or even in New York, areas that were not well served by public transit or by taxis? Like, I don't think there's any argument that that is not the case, right? Does that necessarily have to be provided by a billion-dollar company that chooses to use significant amounts of its revenue undermining the regulatory regime that protects people's safety and protects workers? No. Like, I think it's a false choice that Uber and companies like that have posed, which is like, you can either have access to ride sharing or you can have good workplace standards and safety on the roads. Like, we could as a state choose, and there are folks working on it, to find an alternative path where we get the benefits of it, but we don't do it on the backs of workers and by undermining existing regulation.
Yeah, well, there's the Blue LA program, right? Which is like a nonprofit public-private partnership in Los Angeles that has electric vehicle charging stations in low-income communities, and so it's like an EV, electric vehicle car share aimed at folks that don't have cars, especially in a city where they have pretty lousy public transportation. So that's a pretty cool idea. I'd like to see that happen here in Kingston. But in the meantime, let's see, other questions. We have someone who raised the issue of diesel trucks, that they're not only a source of PM2.5, a serious health hazard, but also black carbon, a significant greenhouse gas emission. And then to turn that into a question, we have a follow-up that are people looking to phase diesel trucks out first? A recent Bloomberg report estimated that electric large vehicles would be cost-effective by 2023. I didn't see that report, but I would like to. Who would like to take on that question? Allison, Uchenna?
I could jump in with just one comment, which is, I know there's been some recent pilots and demonstration projects within New York City of replacing local drayage trucks and freight trucks doing deliveries around the city that would normally be running on diesel with electric models. So I think, like you flagged in your question, a lot of the technology is really catching up. And I think, as much as our state and companies that claim to be committed to, environmental progress can commit to switching to those models as quickly as possible. I think that's a vital place to start for the health and climate impacts that you noted.
Anybody want to add anything? Okay. Meg, next question.
So this is kind of a multi-layered question for Uchenna. Given the complexity of establishing a cap on a non-stationary sector like transportation, and the fact that the cap would mainly address emissions upstream, how will the Transportation and Climate Initiative tackle local or road pollution? And environmental justice communities in New York City, for example, we are impacted by pollution from heavy trucks on the highways and byways that bisect our neighborhoods. Is the assumption that benefits will trickle down to these communities through targeted investments?
Yeah, I think targeted investments are very important, and priorities of the community also very important. I would also say that, sort of like we were saying before, that it's not just, you know, that targeting of sort of making the cap and the fuels, but also all of the complementary policies that target specific locations and the things that are more localized in those heavy duty vehicles, like smog and soot and the things that affect people's health and lives on a more local level. And then in addition to that, on sort of making sure that you're prioritizing investments that the community needs and are ratcheting down the cap, and also ensuring that you're focusing on complementary policies. The CLCPA, you know, really requires that the working groups really focus on local air pollution, and so I hope that mandate helps to ensure local benefits to disadvantaged communities of color, and communities disproportionately impacted by pollution very, very clearly in New York State and beyond.
Anybody else want to chime in there? That was very eloquently answered by Uchenna, but if there are additional thoughts from Allison or Stephan?
I think I would just emphasize that, you know, I was talking in my section about the scope of this problem and, you know, all the ways that transportation as it's currently designed isn't benefiting New Yorkers. And I think it's really important that, like, TCI is not a silver bullet for this problem. And I think just ensuring that we're working and all of us who care about this are showing up and bringing in more people to the table to drive forward a variety of policies to make sure that these benefits are accruing where they're most needed, and to make sure that we're pushing forward across the sector. So I think, you know, it's one tool in the toolbox, and it's an important one, but it's not going to get us all the way there. And it's not going to do everything we need it to do, like any policy.
Stephan, you want to chime in, or should we go on to the next question? We've got a few more.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add on this one, except, I mean, I think it's an interesting question of whether there would be a way to cap different emissions from different sources. That's not, as I understand it currently, in the, like, to have separate caps declining for, say, diesel sold in the New York City than other places, right? But that's not been part of the policy outline this so far, right?
Okay, do you want to do that one?
Yeah. Okay, this might be for Stephan, but anyone can chime in. How do we plan to balance the complexity and time it might take to create the equitable framework with the urgency to start eliminating emissions now in order to reach the New York State targets?
It's a good question. I mean, one answer is my approach is we have to do it equitably, right? And would it be good if we had started working on this question 5 years earlier, or if the federal government was not, you know, a complete barrier to doing some pieces of work on this? but I mean, I think it's like, it has to happen. We have to reduce emissions in the transportation sector, and we have to do it equitably, or people are right to raise concerns and oppose it. I mean, I also think gas taxes are deeply unpopular. And if we're not, as a movement, really taking seriously the critiques of the equity, not just of sort of, is pricing in this way going to impact or not impact environmental justice communities through concentration of emissions, like more broadly, like, is this actually going to be effective? How do we make it equitable? How do we avoid driving, how do we bring emissions down while not driving prices of vehicles and transportation up at too fast a rate for people to absorb? Like, those are really deeply difficult questions, and we're going to need time and deep engagement from the community across the state to get those answers right. And so my answer is we have to balance it, and I don't have that answer, except if we can get it done tomorrow, that's great, but we have to get it done equitably.
Does anyone have that answer? No. Does anyone want to chime in?
I mean, the only other thing I would add is that, that you can also keep looking at it and continue to modify it to make it, I mean, we want to make it as equitable as we can from the get-go and from the gate, out of the gate. But in California, they've also done, they continuously look at the program to make sure that it's working. They evaluate it to make sure that it's reducing pollution in the places that it should be, and for the communities that it should be, and we should do that as well.
Allison? Good, okay. But that is a really critical question, right? Because I think we're all feeling the urgency of the moment with climate change. At the same time, of course, we need to balance those equity concerns. Good talk, everyone. So this is getting into a little bit more of the other solutions with electric school buses. Anybody have the latest on what's happening with electrifying those fleets, and where in New York State do you see to first implement this? I know I recently got to check one out from, I think it was White Plains. That was really cool. But we're not necessarily seeing that happen everywhere the way we'd like to. So does anyone have information on electric school buses?
I'm a little out of date. I know New York City is about to run a pilot for some electric school buses. I know there's some other communities that are ahead of New York City around the state. I mean, I think it's a good example of where the TCI pricing may have some impact, but we need government agencies to really lead. And in reality, it seems, based on most of the research so far, that electric school buses are actually cheaper in the long run than gasoline school buses, and they're safer and less maintenance. And so there's a strong incentive, and we just need to weigh in with our local elected officials and say, we should not be buying more diesel buses from now on, right? Buses cycle out, and we need to start shifting them, and there are people campaigning on that specifically.
And someone actually did just chime in. I'll look up the electric school bus campaign website for lots of good info in New York, and a currently tabled bill. I didn't know there was a bill. So Allison, did you have anything else to add? No? Okay. Yeah, I know some groups, I think Mothers Out Front, actually, I just spoke with an organizer last week from there, and I think they're starting to work on this too. So yeah, great to raise that, and we'll try to get some more information for you all in our follow-up on that. Next question.
How does New York State opt into the Transportation Climate Initiative? Does it take a state statute, administrative action, etc.? And when does New York State have to do this by, assuming there's a deadline?
Uchenna, you want to take that one, or Allison, Stephan?
How we opt into
How we opt into it? Because the deadline is soon, right? I mean, the deadline.
Well, I can hop in maybe, and then other folks can take it from there. I mean, the states that have been working on this policy design process throughout 2019 are expecting to release like a final design proposal by the end of this year. But I think we'll need to see kind of the final policy to figure out what's going to be required at the New York State level for implementation. So it could be legislative, but it could also be the case that it could be implemented under existing authorities and just through administrative action. I think, that conversation won't be coming up as much until that policy is actually announced, since they're still doing modeling and sort of pre-steps like that. So continuing to engage and, continuing to push New York towards being a leader and pushing for the kinds of aggressive caps and the kind of design we need to hit on all the sort of issues we've been talking about throughout this, I think is a good way to set us up to be able to figure out how to join into that process. I think a lot of the details are still being hammered out throughout the region. So it probably depends.
Uchenna, you want to add anything?
Sorry, I had to take myself off mute. No, that sounds exactly right.
Okay. Let's see. Another question. Well, we have a very a long one that's more of a comment, but I will share it because I don't think we've talked about it, and that is about boating. Pleasure boating is a large portion of off-road fossil fuel use. A 44-foot commercial Coast Guard inspected 100% solar-powered tour boat, Solaris, is in operation on the Hudson River in Kingston, which, yes, I have seen it. It's very cool. A similar 100% solar boat left the Hudson River, took the Erie Canal west to the Niagara River, picked up 4 tons of baled cardboard, returned to the Hudson, and went on to a mill in Mechanicville to be recycled into paper. A 750-mile solar-powered round trip. Solar electric marine propulsion can be a practical part of carbon-free transportation. So not a question, but I thought a good story to share about technological innovations, and it's true. Boating is a major source of transportation pollution. So, I presume this too would be covered by the Transportation and Climate Initiative, but maybe there are other policy solutions that are being entertained. Anybody know anything more about boating and solar boats as an alternative? I think Betta's taking one when she's coming to New York this fall, God willing.
I know there's been some electric ferry fleets and things like that, especially over our neighbors across the Atlantic and Norway. I think, we're talking about a climate crisis. So it's needing to move on every front all at once to cut these emissions, because like you're saying, they don't come from just one source. I think in terms of the contribution coming from on-road, a lot of the discussions here have been focused on the mobility options on our roads, like cars and trucks and buses, simply because a lot of people interact with those. And I think we sort of have a unique ability to implement technologies that are more cost-effective and proven in that arena. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to be supporting and celebrating and pushing for further innovations happening on water too.
Word.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I feel like we have to be pushing for further innovation because, a clean transportation and a clean energy future is where we have to go. I mean, there's no question about it. And, we should be at the forefront of that technology, the advanced technology, the technology that the world will use, and those are all things that we are capable of.
Absolutely. This is a question going off the voting topic. Ferries can be a fast way to get from borough to borough in New York City. Do we know if there have been any efforts to electrify these ferries?
I don't know of any, although there has been a lot of discussion about MTA electrification in general, and I imagine that would like spill over to electrifying the ferry fleet.
Yeah, I'm sure it's coming soon.
Okay, yeah, let's hope. So we have a question. Hunts Point just got a renewable natural gas, or fracked gas, as I like to call it, RNG station by Clean Energy. This is great for local air pollution if trucks convert to natural gas. Do you see this as a solution or comparable with electric vehicles? Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I will if nobody else wants to.
Yeah, I'll follow you, Stephen.
I mean, I would say no. I mean, and there was another question about, you know, electric vehicles versus plug-in electric. I mean, I think the goal we at Working Families have stood by is like we need to aim for 100% elimination of fossil fuels, and there may be some uses where we have to, like 20 years from now, debate whether there's a way to get off of it. But like, given the length of time that infrastructure like a natural gas terminal lasts, or a truck for 15 or 20 years, you know, it seems to me like, aside from the broad goal that if we're going to dramatically reduce emissions, then we have to actually like say we're not going to invest in that infrastructure. And I see there's a clarification on chat that renewable natural gas specifically derived from waste. I mean, I think there is a lot of concern about how we would build out a renewable, in quotes, natural gas system. There certainly are emission sources of methane from waste that we should be capturing and using rather than letting them off gas and be pretty significant contributors to global warming. I think that this is an area where, in the short term, infrastructure to support renewable natural gas is almost definitionally going to support fracked gas at the same time. And so I would just be very cautious supporting any solution that's built around that, because I don't see how in the next 10 years we could look at a natural gas solution and say this is only going to support you know, biogas from an anaerobic digester 20 years from now. Like, I think if we get off fossil fuels for the most part, building specific infrastructure becomes easier. But at the moment, most of the advocacy around projects that are focused on renewable natural gas actually is fracked gas infrastructure advocacy.
I would jump in with just 2 points just to emphasize what Stephan said about really focus on battery electric vehicles rather than plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, as well as, you know, fully electric options wherever and whenever we can, because we don't want to be investing in these sunk costs that are going to be continuing to pollute as the time we have left to achieve those emissions reductions decreases. And the other point I would just touch on is some of our Sierra Club colleagues in California have done some research into the amount of biomethane available from sources like dairy farms and landfills and places like that. And it's, I believe that it's not at the scale that would be required to have any significant transportation sectors rely on RNG. And I think given the climate impacts of things like that, focusing upstream on reducing the amount of methane that's being released from those sources to begin with, and not building out infrastructure that's dependent on continuing them or expanding them, particularly if the volume just isn't there to support that kind of option and the trapped gas issues.
Okay, yeah, somebody also just chimed in, you know, why is anyone considering new natural gas investment, considering that natural gas is the worst greenhouse gas emission for the climate, and if you look at its entire life cycle. So another important point. I also want to mention that there is going to be a National Drive Electric Week. One of our attendees brought it up, and I also wanted to mention it to folks. It's something that New Yorkers for Clean Power has engaged in the last few years in different places around the state, and it's really exciting to see even more National Drive Electric Week events pop up in New York State. It's a great way to raise awareness about electric vehicles, both, you know, single passenger cars and municipal fleets. And one of our attendees mentioned the one that we're having in New Paltz, a zero emissions parade in conjunction with the Climate Solutions Summit that we're looking forward to on September 21st at SUNY New Paltz, which Allison is one of our featured speakers. So you can hear all about the exciting new transportation report and more from Allison on transportation and the solutions to addressing this problem. So please register for our Climate Solutions Summit. Come see Allison again, and also think about hosting your own National Drive Electric Week event or finding out about one near you. We'll also provide a link to that in our follow-up email to everybody. It's going to be an epic follow-up, so make sure you check your inbox. And I think that's pretty much it for our questions. So yeah, good job, everybody. I'm so impressed that we still have a critical mass hanging in there till the very end, and we're ending on time. And I guess the one other question that we didn't raise, which Mick, do you want to ask it? And it's kind of a big picture question about beneficial electrification in general, or what I like to call electrify everything, meaning transportation and buildings. So yeah, should we just raise that? Sure. and end it on a big thinking question?
Yeah. Okay, will we have enough electricity to electrify both the transportation and building sector? The building sector is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in New York State, and is a big issue that we talk about a lot and needs to be addressed, like transportation.
So anybody want to take that on? Greening the grid. I think I heard something like if we electrify transportation and buildings the way we need to in the next 10 years, then our electricity use would double. I don't know, I could be making that up, but I think I remember hearing that. Does anybody want to comment on this? I think it is a really important point, and speaks to the need for more solar, more wind, more renewable energy. But somebody else, take it away.
One thing I would flag is in New York, we recently had an announcement that 1,700 megawatts of offshore wind are going to be built off the eastern coast of our state. There's projects proposed throughout upstate and along, our Great Lakes, which are a wonderful source of wind, opportunities for distributed solar, as well as utility scale solar. And so I think, folks getting involved in their own community and figuring out what projects are around near them, showing up to support those, and, encouraging their utility to continue to invest in those and continuing to choose renewable sources. We're lucky to live in a state that, has an abundance of wind. And even if it doesn't feel like it in February in Rochester, an abundance of solar. And I think, supporting those projects and ensuring they get built will help us kind of make sure that as we track our electrification of transportation up, we're also greening the grid. So we're getting those co-benefits at the same time.
I would just add, I agree with that. There's also, I think, we can make tremendous gains in efficiency, and both buildings and transportation are incredibly inefficient at the moment, and estimates vary, but I think most of those estimates essentially are that we could cut a significant amount from transportation. I know the building side a lot more, but we could use 50% less energy than we use now, and if that comes from renewable sources, that puts us a good chunk of the way. There are lots of barriers to getting anywhere near the scale of renewables we need to meet some piece of this, and we need to solve those. And if we solve them, then reaching the point where we power everything with renewable energy is not that much harder.
All good points. And I do want to, we're getting our good out of you panelists. And we have a couple more minutes. And I do see that there was a question that I missed about sprawl. So it's not over till it's over. Someone pointed out the importance of limiting, let's see, where did it go? Uchenna, you raised this. Do you see where that question went? About sprawl. We haven't talked as much on this online teach-in, which we can in the future, about walkable communities and all of the importance of safe bike lanes and all of that, which is really critical. But I don't know if you just want to mention something, Uchenna, and with respect to that question about the sprawl issue.
Yeah. Did you want me to read the question, or
sure.
No? Okay. Well, for sprawl, I think land use planning is critical and important for development to ensure that we reduce sprawl. And so, yeah, it says important complementary policies is reversing direct and indirect subsidies to sprawl, low-density development, especially at area fringe. Are those being looked at? So yeah, I would say yes. Land use policies are absolutely a complementary, or are part of what we need to make sure we look at to reduce our carbon footprint across the board. And so it's one of those things that helps us to achieve the goals that we are looking to, the ambitious goals that we're looking to achieve, to have good land use policies across the board. Sorry, that was like a sprawled answer.
It's 8:30 at night, so I think we're doing good here. We're answering every question. Thank you for your thoroughness, Uchenna, and catching that, and to all of you for your expertise and your generosity, with your time tonight, and to all of our wonderful attendees. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I know I learned a lot.
Yeah,
hopefully we all did, and we're gonna keep at it, keep learning, and moving forward as we get off fossil fuels and electrify our grid, or electrify transportation, buildings, green our grid. One of our attendees pointed out the importance of CCA in greening the grid, of community choice aggregation. Signing your community up for that. Maybe we'll make that the subject of a future online teach-in. So look out in your inbox for future ones. But at the very least, we hope to see many of you at our Climate Solutions Summit, September 21st at SUNY New Paltz. And we'll be sending follow-ups with the survey. So please fill it out. And thanks again. Amazing panelists. Thank you for your incredible work on this issue and many others. So go team.
And thank you to you. Thank you to you, Michaela and Betta, for pulling this together.
Yeah. And thanks to all the attendees and everybody.
Yeah.
Great.
Thirded, fourthed. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.